Hey, folks, it's your boy, the boss economist, back with another piping hot dose of economic truth bombs. If you're new here, buckle up, because we're about to shred through the latest government mismanagement, economic clownery, and policy disasters that are tanking our wallets, our jobs, and our future. And if you're a long-time viewer, welcome back, you masochists for economic reality. Today, we're diving headfirst into the tariff tantrum of 2025, starring none other than White House trade advisor Peter Navarro and his fearless leader, Donald Trump. Spoiler alert, it's a masterclass in economic self-sabotage, and guess who's paying the price? You, me, and every hardworking citizen on both sides of the border. Let's roll. Oh, folks, it's tariff season again, and the White House is serving up a fresh batch of economic chaos. On Thursday, July 10, 2025, President Trump announced a jaw-dropping 35% tariff on Canadian imports, set to kick in on August 1, 2025. And who's out there cheerleading this madness? None other than Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor who seems to think economic policy is a reality TV show where the goal is to alienate allies and tank global trade. In a Bloomberg television interview on Friday, July 11, Navarro had the audacity to say, "I would urge the Canadian citizens to urge their leaders to negotiate fairly with us." Oh, bless his heart, because nothing screams fair negotiation like threatening a 35% tariff on your closest trading partner. Now, before we dive into the juicy details, let's set the stage. The US and Canada share the world's largest bilateral trade relationship, with over $718 billion in goods and services traded annually, according to the US Trade Representative's 2024 data. Canada is the top export destination for 36 US states, and the US is Canada's largest market, accounting for 75% of its exports. We're talking about an economic partnership so tight, it's practically a marriage. But apparently, Trump and Navarro think the best way to spice up this marriage is to throw a Molotov cocktail into the living room. Let's start with the basics, folks, because apparently, the White House needs a refresher course in Economics 101. Tariffs are not paid by the country you're targeting, they're paid by your own citizens. When Trump slaps a 35% tariff on Canadian imports, it's not Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney writing a check to Uncle Sam. It's American businesses and consumers footing the bill. According to a 2024 study by the Tax Foundation, tariffs imposed during Trump's first term cost U.S. consumers and businesses an estimated $80 billion annually in higher prices and lost economic efficiency. And that was with tariffs averaging around 20%. Now, we're talking 35% on Canada, one of our biggest suppliers of everything from oil to lumber to auto parts. Let's break this down with a real-world example. Canada is the U.S.'s largest supplier of crude oil, accounting for 61% of U.S. oil imports in 2024, per the U.S. Energy Information Administration. A 35% tariff on Canadian oil would jack up the price of gasoline at the pump, hitting every American driver where it hurts. And don't even get me started on lumber. Canada supplies 28% of U.S. softwood lumber, and with housing affordability already in the gutter, median home prices hit $420,000 in Q2 2025, per the National Association of Realtors. Higher lumber costs will make building homes even more expensive. So, congratulations, White House, you've just made driving and homeownership more unaffordable for the average American. Take a bow. Now, Navarro and Trump are quick to point out that these tariffs don't cover goods imported under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Oh, how generous. The USMCA, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, covers most of Canada's exports to the US, so the White House is framing this as a targeted tariff that won't hurt too much. But here's the catch, folks, this is a classic bait and switch. While the USMCA does protect many goods, it doesn't cover everything, and the uncertainty alone is enough to send shockwaves through the economy. Take the auto industry, for example. The USMCA has strict rules of origin, requiring 75% of a vehicle's parts to be made in North America to qualify for tariff-free trade. But here's the kicker, Canada and the US are already struggling to meet these requirements, with supply chain disruptions from the 2023 semiconductor shortage still lingering. A 2025 report from the Center for Automotive Research estimates that a 35% tariff on non-USMCA compliant auto parts from Canada could increase the average price of a new car in the US by $2,500. And who's buying those cars? You guessed it, American consumers, already stretched thin by inflation that hit 6.8% in June 2025, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, let's talk about Navarro's attempt to paint Canada as the villain in this trade soap opera. In his Bloomberg interview, he said, "We were negotiating with both the Mexicans and the Canadians, and the Mexicans were pure joy to deal with. The Canadians were very, very difficult, and they've always been very difficult. Oh, cry me a river, Peter. Canada's difficulty is that they're not willing to roll over and let the US bully them into unfair trade terms. And let's not forget, Canada has its own tariffs and trade barriers, sure, but so does the US. According to the World Trade Organization, the U.S. average applied tariff rate in 2024 was 3.3%, while Canada's was 4.1%. Hardly a gaping chasm of unfairness. But here's the real issue, this tariff threat isn't about fairness, it's about politics. Trump's base loves a good, America first soundbite, and nothing screams tough on trade like picking a fight with Canada, the polite neighbor who's been our economic BFF for decades. Meanwhile, the real economic threats, like China's dominance in critical minerals, they control 60% of global rare earth production, per the U.S. Geological Survey, or the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, set to hit U.S. exporters in 2026, are being ignored. Instead, we're wasting time and money on a tariff war with Canada, a country that poses zero strategic threat and is literally our largest energy supplier. Now, let's zoom out and look at the big picture, folks, because this tariff tantrum isn't happening in a vacuum. The U.S. economy is already on shaky ground. GDP growth slowed to 1.8% in Q2 2025, down from 2.5% in Q1, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Consumer confidence is tanking, with the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index dropping to 92.3 in June 2025, its lowest level since mid-2023. And let's not forget the Federal Reserve's Tightrope Act. After raising interest rates to 5.5% in 2024 to combat inflation, the Fed is now hinting at rate cuts in late 2025, but it might be too little, too late. Add a tariff war with Canada into this mix, and you've got a recipe for a full-blown recession. A 2025 study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that a 35% tariff on Canadian imports could shave 0.5% off U.S. GDP growth in 2026, pushing us dangerously close to negative territory. And it's not just the U.S., Canada's economy, already battered by a housing bubble. Toronto home prices fell 12% year-over-year in Q1 2025, per the Canadian Real Estate Association, would take a massive hit, potentially dragging down North American trade as a whole. Here's the kicker, folks, this entire mess is a self-inflicted wound. The White House had months to negotiate with Canada, but instead of playing chess, they're playing whack-a-mole with tariffs. And let's not forget the hypocrisy. Trump spent his first term touting the USMCA as the greatest trade deal ever, but now he's threatening to undermine it with unilateral tariffs. If you're a business owner trying to plan your supply chain, or a worker wondering if your job is safe, this kind of uncertainty is a nightmare. A 2025 survey by the National Association of Manufacturers found that 68% of U.S. manufacturers cited trade policy uncertainty as their top concern, ahead of labor shortages and inflation. And where's Congress in all this? Oh, right, sitting on their hands, as usual. Under the Constitution, Congress has the power to regulate commerce, but they've outsourced that responsibility to the executive branch, letting Trump and Navarro run wild with tariffs. Meanwhile, the Biden administration's legacy of unchecked spending, the national debt hit $35 trillion in 2025, per the U.S. Treasury, has left the economy vulnerable to shocks like this. So, congratulations, government, you've managed to combine fiscal irresponsibility with trade policy insanity. Truly a bipartisan achievement. Alright, folks, let's wrap this up with some straight talk. This tariff threat against Canada is economic malpractice, plain and simple. It's a tax on American consumers, a middle finger to our closest ally, and a one-way ticket to Recessionville. And the worst part? It's all so unnecessary. If the White House really cared about fair trade, they'd focus on modernizing the USMCA, investing in domestic manufacturing. U.S. manufacturing output fell 1.2% in 2024, per the Federal Reserve, and addressing real threats like China's economic coercion. Instead, we get this circus. So, what can you do, dear viewer? First, call your representatives and tell them to take back their constitutional authority over trade. Second, diversify your investments. Tariff wars mean market volatility, so look into inflation-protected assets like tips or commodities. Gold hit $2,800 an ounce in July 2025, per Kitco News. And third, keep watching Boss Economics World, because we're not afraid to call out the clowns in Washington who are tanking our economy. That's all for today, folks. If you liked this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more economic truth bombs. And remember, when the government screws up, it's your wallet that pays the price. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next one.